Welcome to another edition of Eye on the Issues. And today we are joined by Jim Magagna. He is the EVP of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. Jim, welcome to Eye on the Issues. Let's begin by, why don't you give us a little bit of your background in terms of what you do?
Certainly. My personal background before coming to Wyoming Stock Growers, I've been a rancher all my life. I was a sheep rancher in Western Wyoming. Still have a ranch over there, although I don't run my own sheep anymore. I bring others in. Spent many years very active in industry groups at the state and national level, the sheep industry, the National Public Lands Council, served as president of both those national groups. Then came back to Wyoming and ran unsuccessfully for the Wyoming legislature in 1994. Followed that up with about a 3-year stint as the director of the Office of State Lands and Investments for the state of Wyoming. And then shortly thereafter came to the Wyoming Stock Growers. So I've been in the current position for approximately 26 years.
Nice. Now, let's talk, if we can, about, I guess, what's called the Rock Springs Management Plan. It's a BLM plan. Can you kind of give us a 10,000-foot picture of what that is?
Sure. The Rock Springs area that's BLM land management is a total of about 3.2 million acres of public land, and then private lands interspersed, and quite a lot of private land in the southern part of it, because it includes what's known as the checkerboard, which is the land where the Union Pacific Railroad came through Wyoming, and the federal government gave every other section of land to the railroad as an enticement to build the railroad. So that's now privately owned by various entities, and then the intermingled sections are public. Then both north and south of that are large tracts of public lands with intermingled both private lands and state trust lands.
And so from a livestock standpoint, for example, talk about the BLM land, what that means for the people of Wyoming, and how this plan may impact that.
Well, particularly in the western half of the state of Wyoming, there's so much public land that virtually every ranching operation is heavily dependent on grazing public lands. Those lands are intermingled with the private and state lands. So it's really important that you're able to manage a ranching unit without a huge distinction. As I like to point out, that sheep or cow out there grazing doesn't know when they're on public land or when they're on private land. And most ranchers don't draw that distinction. They manage it all with the same care and dedication to having a healthy resource. So whenever something happens that's specific to public lands that doesn't recognize that, it poses serious threats and challenges to our ranching community.
So talk to me about the ranching community of Wyoming right now from a standpoint of how would you compare the environment today versus, let's say, for example, 10 years ago?
Well, the environment as to public lands in particular, or in general?
In general.
In general, a couple of things have changed. One, we've had some challenging years market-wise for the cattle industry, which is the primary component of the ranching industry. Sheep have had that as well, although this year is a very strong market on the cattle side. The other thing that's critical to ranching is the weather situation. And after some drought years, we had a year of huge snowfall in fall of 2022-23 that added some significant cost to ranching, and now we're back to a little more normal scenario. But as I often like to say, if you're in ranching in Wyoming, there are 3 things that are important to you: the weather, the markets, and the government. And today, the market and the weather have been reasonably favorable for us, at least this year. The direction that government policy is taking is our biggest challenge.
And so describe that a little, if you can drill down on that a little bit more. What's going on with government policy, and how would you like to see it move forward?
Well, in a very general sense, it's just more regulation, more policy, more change that we've seen, particularly in the last 3 years that we hadn't anticipated. So it affects us on the natural resources on our public land, certainly with the Rock Springs RMP and the conservation rule and a whole host of regulation been coming down. The solar plan, the sagegrass plan, it's just been one after the other here recently. It impacts us with endangered species, with rule changes and policy changes with regards to management of endangered species. It impacts us outside of the natural resource arena, certainly with some changes involving marketing, transportation, a whole host of those factors, all of which impact livestock grazing in Wyoming and particularly throughout the West. And in most cases, not all certainly, but in most cases, the regulatory changes and the policy changes we've seen the last couple of years have been far less favorable to our interests than those we were operating under, at least during the previous Trump administration, but in many cases for the last 30 or 40 years that have been more favorable to us than what we're seeing today.
And so is there a way to push back on that, or what can be done, or do you just have to wait and see with the new administration?
Well, there's a lot of pushback. Pushback is important. Here at Wyoming Stock Growers Association, we submit comments on virtually every one of those documents. In some cases, as the Rock Springs RMP is one of those where we've just filed a formal protest to the proposed final decision. And when I came to Stock Growers 26 years ago, this organization very seldom been involved in litigation. In the past 10 years, we find ourselves very often involved in litigation. In very few cases, litigation that we initiate, but in most cases, litigation is being brought by environmental groups that are opposed to our use of the land, opposed to public land grazing, in which we then either file an intervention or file an amicus brief to support our positions.
And you can't appreciate having to spend your members' money on legal fees.
Well, that's a very difficult challenge, and we do spend a significant amount of their money on it. We've been fortunate to develop some good relationships with, for example, Mountain States Legal Foundation out of Denver, which has represented us on some interest clear back into the 90s, but 1990s, but more frequently today on a number of these issues that we can work with them as a nonprofit. We don't pay anything for their legal services, but we certainly encourage our members and others to be supportive of them.
Now, it doesn't appear that Governor Gordon is in favor of this BLM, the proposed Rock Springs RMP, if you will. Is that going to impact anything, or does the federal government not care?
Oh, it's going to impact many things. I mean, the immediate impacts on, for example, energy development are far more than they are even on our industry. The original plan that came out was the result of about 20 years of work. Since 2012, they started working on this. So not 20 years of work, but close to 15 years of work. And they came out with the preferred alternative that was just almost laughable. It was so ridiculous in terms of its impacts on virtually every use of the public lands, recreational use, grazing use, energy development, you name it, there were negative impacts. The governor immediately put together a task force. I served as a grazing representative on it. We spent days working through that, providing input to the BLM, objecting to things and suggesting alternatives would be more acceptable to us. Mm-hmm. The BLM came out here on August 23rd with their proposed final alternative, which I will say, particularly in the grazing arena, they did accept many of our recommendations. There are still some broad things in the plan that could be very harmful to grazing, but on very grazing specific things, they were fairly receptive, but it's still a way overboard. One of the best examples is prior to this initiative, we had a couple 100,000 acres of what are called ACECs, or areas of critical environmental concern, identified in the whole Rock Springs RMP. Those are where there are unique characteristics that the agency has determined need some special management in order to be protected. In the draft that came out, they went from a couple thousand to 1.6 million acres, nearly half of the entire area, to be an ACEC. That was totally unacceptable. The final that came out here this past month still contains about 800,000 acres of ACECs, and that's the primary issue on which our organization has filed a protest now, feeling that that again far exceeds what Congress ever intended when they gave the agency the authority to use ACECs as a management tool.
In respect to solar and wind, what kind of impact does that have on the grazing there in Wyoming, or does it have any at all?
Well, it can. Wind in particular can be both. I mean, if it occurs on private land, it can be an outstanding source of revenue to private landowners. And many of our members have endorsed wind facilities on their land. There's some disturbance while they're being put together and put up, but after that, they don't significantly interfere with continued livestock grazing, so it can work fairly well. Solar, less so, although there's some experiments going on with some success in other parts of the country with grazing under solar panels with sheep. Given the nature of our land here, the lack of moisture in that, I don't anticipate that's going to be a good fit here. But when it comes to public lands, we're more skeptical of wind and solar simply because it's not what you work out as a grazing permittee or with the solar developers or the wind developers. It's what the federal agency gives them, and then they basically can control how livestock grazing continues, if it does so, what the conditions will be, whether they prohibit some grazing or reduce grazing significantly during the development phases. That's all in the government's hands, not in our hands. So it's more problematic there. But
so I would think ranching, raising livestock is something that kind of, it goes from family, from generation to generation to generation. But let's say somebody, right now, they see what's going on in this country and like, I want to get out of here. I want to go to Wyoming. I want to maybe get into ranching. What are the entry points? How difficult it is to get into that industry?
Well, we're seeing a couple of things, perhaps as a quick background to that. If you went back 30 years and a ranch was put up for sale because there weren't heirs in the family that wanted to take it over and operate it, it was pretty much a given that the neighbors would buy it out and they would split it up in some manner or grow their own operations. Today, with high land values the way they are and the challenges involved in ranching, that doesn't happen too often. So when a ranch becomes available for acquisition today, either a couple of things happen. Either it doesn't continue in ranching, it gets subdivided up into 40-acre lots or something for sale, or people from out of state come in and acquire them, good people, but whose goal is not to be a successful rancher. It's a goal to own a wonderful, magnificent piece of real estate that they can enjoy, do some ranching on it to maintain its ag land status, but not much beyond that. So it's for young people wanting to get in because of land values and even livestock values and costs. It's really a challenge today. We focus heavily on trying to help that happen. One of the tools we've used with some success is conservation easements, which not fit for everyone, but they can allow a rancher to derive a significant part of the economic value of the ranch and then be able to, on a more affordable basis, make it available to people wanting to come in and initiating a future in ranching. But it's a really big challenge today, and we don't see a lot of it happening, unfortunately.
That is unfortunate. All right, so I've got to ask you this final question. What do you like most about Wyoming?
What do I like most about Wyoming? Well, I'm certainly enamored with the wide open spaces, and I love the mountains. I've spent a lot of time up there in my ranching career, but I love the desert just as well, and I can be very happy in the middle of sagebrush country. So that's one thing. But on an equal basis with that, today I would say for the most part, the true Wyoming people, the people who were born and raised here, who have spent multiple generations of their families here, and it's hard to meet someone in Wyoming who's lived here more than 20 years that if you start a conversation, if you're not related, some of the same people, or there's some tie that brings you together. And I think that's something to really be proud of and to strive to continue in our state. And it's our small population allows it to happen, but just the attitude of most of the people in Wyoming has made it possible as well.
Nice. Yeah. Small, but a great population you have there.
Yes.
So if people want to learn out more about the Wyoming Liberty Group, and go to wyliberty.org, sign up for our newsletter. Jim, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. There's so much we could talk about. This could go on for hours and hours, but I appreciate the opportunity to put it forward and look forward to the next chance to visit with you.
Absolutely. Be safe on your travels.
Thank you.